The Girls on the Shore by Anne Cleeves. Read by Jack Holden. The Girls on the Shore. Read by Jack Holden. Detective Inspector Matthew Venn walked along the track from his house and onto the beach. The tide was low and the sand seemed to stretch almost to the opposite bank of the estuary. From his kitchen window he'd seen two young girls standing in the middle distance. They were holding hands and had their backs to him, staring, it seemed, towards Instow or Appledore. This was where the two North Devon rivers met, and the town stood, oddly majestic in the early morning light, marking the Torridge entrance on the opposite shore. The River Tor ran just below his house. This wasn't a tourist beach, and it wasn't the time of year for children to be playing. It was January, cold and clear, a different sort of day for this coast where the westerly winds usually blew rain and cloud. He'd woken to a grass frost, ice on the puddles on the drive, a bright orange sun when at last it rose behind the house. Matthew had met few children. His sergeant, Jen Rafferty, had a boy and a girl, but they were almost grown up, and he only knew of them second-hand. These girls looked younger, and this was a school day. Matthew's husband, Jonathan, had already left for work, but Matthew had time owing, and the police station was going through a quiet phase, so he had taken the morning off. The children weren't dressed for the beach. Both wore plaid skirts, old-fashioned long grey socks, blazers, and patent leather shoes. A school uniform that he didn't recognize. He imagined that their knees would be red with the cold, that the salt damp of the shore would be seeping through the soles of the shoes. He looked all the way along the beach, but saw no adults. Surrounded by all the space, the clear sky, and the light reflecting from the wet sand, they could have been sculptures, representing isolation or loneliness, or mutual support. He'd pulled on Wellington boots before setting out. His work shoes were of good quality, and he didn't want to ruin them. The boots made sucking and splashing noises as he crossed the pools left by the tide, but the girls didn't turn to see who was coming. As he got closer, he saw that each had her hair plaited in one long braid down her back. When he was 10 meters away, the children did turn, and they stared at him. Their knees were red, their eyes watery with the cold, and wary. They seemed a little older than he'd first thought. One could be a teenager, almost on the brink of womanhood, but stranded in childhood by the uniform and the hairstyle. "Hello," he said. He wished Jonathan were here. Jonathan ran clubs for kids in the arts centre he managed, drama workshops and pottery sessions. The woodyard hired out rooms for birthday parties, and Jonathan often played the jovial uncle, dressing up as Santa at Christmas. He would know how best to deal with this pair, though it seemed to Matthew that these girls needed more than a jovial uncle now that they were, somehow, lost. "What are you doing here?" "Is it private?" The older girl asked the question. No accent, but that didn't mean they weren't local. Lots of members of the educated middle classes had moved to North Devon in search of the good life, and there were many of the homegrown variety too. "Shouldn't we be here?" "No, it's not private." He found her stare disconcerting. "You have every right to be here." A pause. "Why are you on your own? Where are your parents?" The girls looked at each other. "We don't know," the younger child said. He thought she seemed on the verge of tears, and he couldn't bear the thought of her crying. "And there's only our mother at home now." "Daddy's working away." The older child's voice was firm, reproving. He hesitated for a moment. He was reluctant to ask two young girls to come with him when he was on his own, but he could hardly leave them here. He looked at his phone. No reception. "Why don't we go indoors? That's my house over there," he said, pointing. "It'll be warmer there, and we can find out what's happened to them." "You're a stranger. We know not to go anywhere with strangers." "Quite right. But I happen to be a stranger who's a police officer." He fished in his jacket pocket for a warrant card and was relieved when he found it. He didn't have much use for it these days, now that he spent most of his time stuck behind a desk. He showed it to the older girl. She took it in her hand and studied it carefully. "Let's get you warmed up. I could make some hot chocolate." There was a moment's hesitation, and then they nodded in tandem. Inside the house, the two girls thawed out, literally and metaphorically. Their names were Olivia and Imogen Sellers, and they were 13 and 9 respectively. They lived in the smartest street in Barnstable. Their mother was called Elizabeth. There was no mention of their father. They sat at the kitchen table with mugs of hot chocolate in front of them. Even the elder girl had a faint, milky moustache after drinking a little. "So, tell me how you came to be on the beach this morning." Olivia took a time to answer, but it was already clear that she would be the one to tell the story. "We were on our way to school." "Which school?" "Brooks. It's private, for girls. Mummy said we'd do better at a girls' school." A pause. "She said we're very lucky to be there." "And where is the school?" Matthew had never heard of it, but then why should he have done? Jen Rafferty's kids went to the local comp. She would have considered a private school a betrayal of all she believed in. Imogen stared at him with astonishment. It seemed that the school was the centre of her world. "So," he said, "you were on your way to school?" He'd be able to find the place soon enough. "Mummy had a phone call," Olivia said, before adding quickly, "She pulled into the side of the road to take it. She'd never drive while she was using her mobile." "Quite right." "Then she drove us here to the beach. She left us in the car and said she'd only be 5 minutes, but she was gone ages, so we went down onto the sand to look for her, in case anything had happened to her." From the tone of the girl's voice, Matthew thought perhaps things had happened to Mummy in the past. "Perhaps we should look for the car then," he said, "in case she's back there and waiting for you." "We did try," Olivia said, "but we couldn't find it, so we came back to the beach." "Mummy loves the beach." Imogen looked up at him. Her chocolate moustache gave the younger girl the look of an animal with fur or whiskers, a dormouse with big grey eyes. "We thought she'd be there." "Do either of you have a mobile?" Matthew was torn. He wasn't sure whether he should leave the girls here on their own, but he didn't want to take them out into the cold again. The red knees and the eyes streaming in the icy air had deeply affected him. Besides, he was a detective, and in his work he came across dreadful sights. The previous spring there'd been a body here on Crow Point, where the rivers met the sea. The girls shook their heads. "Mummy doesn't approve of screens at school." He came to a decision. "Why don't you stay here? No point everyone getting cold. I'll have a quick look and come back to let you know what's going on." He looked at them. They were serious. Anxious, but perhaps not anxious enough. Maybe it wasn't unusual for Mummy suddenly to disappear. This time they nodded their agreement. "Can you describe your mother's car?" Again it was Olivia who answered. "It's a black Golf." "Daddy took the Lexus," Imogen said. Olivia shot her a look of warning. Matthew thought this family was full of secrets. Outside, the sun was stronger, but it felt no warmer. He found the car quite quickly, hidden in one of the more obscure parking spots, surrounded by dunes. He could see how the girls might have missed it. They had left the doors unlocked when they'd gone out looking for their mother, and he looked inside. No sign of the missing Elizabeth Sellers. Matthew took out his mobile and hit a number. "Jen, can you do me a favour, please? Come to my house. There are 2 girls in the kitchen. I found them on the beach and their mother's gone missing. Sit with them. Find out a bit more about them. The family name is Sellers, and they're Olivia and Imogen. I don't really want to be alone with them if I can't find the woman." "Course, boss." The Scouse accent was reassuring. He'd been discomfited by the girls, with their hair pulled tight back from their faces and their watchful eyes. Jen would know the best way to talk to them. "And see if you can track down their father. Apparently he's working away at the moment, but I don't know what sort of business he's in." "Sure." He could tell that she was already moving, and heard a door slam shut before the line went dead. Inside, the car seemed spotless, rubbish-free. It was hard to believe that a real family, real children had ever been inside. Matthew liked order, had inherited an obsession with cleanliness from his evangelical mother, but even his car had an occasional sweet wrapper on the floor or a used parking ticket on the dashboard. He leant in and felt under the seats. Right at the back, under the driver's seat, there was a half bottle of vodka. Empty. He had a picture of the woman, sitting in her car on the grand drive in the smart street, drinking herself into oblivion, while the girls were in the house doing their homework. He assumed that the expensive school, which they considered themselves lucky to attend, would give their pupils a lot of homework. If the mother were ill, an alcoholic, that might explain her daughter's watchful eyes, their wariness. The girls would be used to making excuses for her. She would have made them complicit. Perhaps the father had run away, unable to cope. But it wouldn't explain the phone call that had caused Elizabeth to pull into the side of the road, the diversion to Braunton Great Marsh and the beach, with the girls still in the car. Something urgent must have brought her here. He climbed the shingle bank and walked along the beach away from the house and towards Crow Point. He saw the woman almost immediately, sitting on the dry sand, her back to the dune. The girls had been searching in quite the wrong direction, because this must be Elizabeth Sellers. Who else could it be? He hadn't seen her when he was standing with the girls because of the curve of the shore. She was wearing a long down coat with the hood up. She was alone. If she'd been summoned to a meeting on the shore, it was over. The way that the woman sat gave the impression that she was listless and disheartened. Had she been brought here by her husband? Had she learned in some cold, bitter exchange that her marriage was finally over? Matthew's work was all about what if. He was always playing out different scenarios in his mind. Jonathan said that was why he was such a good detective. He had imagination, creativity. Matthew pictured a standoff between two adults, raised voices and tears, the father driving off in his expensive car, leaving the mother to come to terms with a new and lonely life. As he got closer, Matthew suspected that Elizabeth had been drinking, all thoughts of her daughters forgotten. She seemed slumped against the sandbank. He imagined her drowning in self-pity and vodka, and he felt a flash of anger. These moments of fury came to him occasionally, unbidden as strikes of lightning. He was always ashamed of his lack of control once they'd passed, but he thought now that the Sellers girls, with their politeness and old-fashioned uniforms, deserved better. "Mrs. Sellers?" There was no reaction, no sign of life at all, and then another picture came into his head. A body on a beach, a man in cheap jeans and a denim jacket, a tattoo of an albatross on his neck. The first murder case he had investigated had begun not far from here. He began processing this as an unexplained death and sorting his response. He would need a medic and to contact his colleagues. Although this was more likely to be suicide, they'd need to be sure. At that point the woman turned her head. The movement in her voice, pleasant and deep, startled him. "Yes?" "I found your daughters on the beach. They're in my house. They're a little anxious, but quite safe." "Oh, I'm so sorry. Poor things. I've been sitting here much longer than I realized." She didn't sound drunk to him, but he knew that alcoholics could be magnificent actors. She started to scramble to her feet. He held out a hand to help her up. Now he was very close to her, but he couldn't smell drink on her breath or her clothes. "Is anything wrong? The girls said you were driving them to school when you got a call." "Did they?" She looked up at him. Her hood had fallen away from her face. Her skin was very pale and smooth, her mouth a little too wide, her blonde hair short and expertly cut. "No, nothing wrong. Not really. I was feeling under the weather and needed some fresh air. I'm a police officer. It's in my nature to be suspicious, to ask awkward questions." She said nothing and swept loose sand from her coat with her hands. The sunlight caught the grains and made them sparkle like gold dust. He continued, The girls will be very late for school." "Yes." She gave him a little smile. "I suppose they will. I should go and collect them, get them on their way." He wasn't sure what else to say. Perhaps he was making a drama out of a rather trivial domestic incident. He had no proof that a crime had been committed or that the children were in any kind of danger. Elizabeth set off along the beach, walking very quickly. He was about to say that it might be easier if they cut across the bank and walked along the track, but she'd already turned the corner of the point and they could see the white house ahead of them. "That's my house," he said. "That's where they are." "It was very kind of you to take them in." She spoke as if this was a final comment and there was nothing more to say. He supposed that when they got to the house, she would call the children to her, and they would obey immediately and follow her out to her car. They would drive away, and he would have no reason to be involved again. The thought made him feel sick, panicky. He could call social services and explain his unease, but emergency social workers had many cases of neglect and cruelty to investigate. Would they really see this as a safeguarding issue? Her mother had felt unwell, left her children in the car while she went for a walk and got some air. Perhaps that would be considered a more responsible thing to do than to continue driving. He thought he would contact the school later and see if they had any concerns. He could do that, at least. Approaching the house, he saw Jen's car in the drive and immediately relaxed a little. Jen didn't suffer from flights of fancy. Through the long window, he saw the three of them in the kitchen. Olivia was reading a book, frowning with concentration, and Imogen was drawing. They were ignoring Jen, who seemed to be trying to engage with the younger girl, standing behind her, looking down at the picture. But she might not have been there, so absorbed were the girls in what they were doing. "Who's that?" Elizabeth's voice was sharp, almost imperious. "Her colleague. I asked her to look after your daughters while I came to find you." The woman nodded, almost relieved it seemed. "Thanks so much for all your trouble. We can leave you in peace now." "Why don't you come in for a coffee?" "Oh no," she said. "That's very kind, but I really should get them to school." Jen had seen them approaching the house and came to the door to meet them. Elizabeth Sellers shouted across her to her daughters inside the kitchen. "Come along, girls, time to go. Please thank the lady for looking after you." "Not yet," Jen said. She blocked the doorway with her body. The girls, who were starting to pack up, looked confused. Jen turned back to them. "I bet you're a bit peckish. I happen to know that the blue tin on the bench is where Matthew keeps his biscuits. Why don't you help yourselves? Finish that drawing, Imogen. It's brilliant. I just want a quick chat with your mum." The girls sat, frozen. Imogen looked at her mother for permission, expecting, it seemed, to be denied the treat. But Elizabeth nodded. Jen had taken her coat from a kitchen chair and pulled it on over her jeans and sweater. "It's a bit parky outside, but I could do with some good clean air. We'll sit here, shall we? We don't want the girls earwigging." She was acting as if she owned the place, leading them to garden chairs placed around a white wrought-iron table. The trees to the side of the house were bare, and it felt as if they were surrounded by space and light. Exposed. In the summer, Matthew and Jonathan sat here after work with a glass of wine, looking at the sunset. Now the seat was icy through his clothes and his breath came in clouds. "Well," Jen said to the woman sitting opposite to her, facing out at the view, the wide sky, and the estuary slowly filling up with water. "What's been going on at home?" "I don't know what you mean." "I've been phoning around," Jen said. "One of my posh neighbours has a daughter at your girls' school. Brooks, is it called? Seems your kids haven't been there since Christmas." "Ah, yes, it's their first day back for a week. They've been a little unwell." The woman's voice was tense, tight. "I've seen the bruises on Imogen's arms," Jen said, "where she's been gripped too hard. Old bruises, but they still hurt her. Olivia wouldn't let me look at her body. Too embarrassed, maybe. Or trying to protect someone." There was silence. "I assume that was why you kept them off school." "You can't understand." "Oh, Believe me, I understand. Jen was barely keeping her self-control. I was married to a bastard who beat me. When he started on the kids, that was when I left him. You think my husband hurt the girls? Elizabeth's shock seemed genuine enough. No, he wouldn't do that. Was it you then? Matthew kept his voice gentle. He'd take over the interview now. If Jen lost her temper, the woman would only become distant and defensive. I found the empty bottle in your car. Alcoholism is an illness. We can get help for you. Support. Is that what you think? That I'm an alcoholic? The fight had left her. She leaned forwards, her head in her hands. No, I'm not a drinker. Not in that way. Why don't you explain? It's been such a fight, she said, holding it all together. Matthew said nothing and shot Jen a look to stop her from speaking too. Elizabeth wanted to talk. She was just trying to find the right words. She looked up. We were older parents. I was 39 when Olivia was born, and my husband Will is 6 years older than me. Our lives were ordered. We had careers, a lovely house. We didn't think a baby would change things very much. We were competent adults. We'd managed the arrival of a small human being into our home as we'd managed everything else. But Olivia was difficult from the beginning. She hardly slept, and she cried. Oh, how she cried! And as she got older, she was never still, never content. I took time off work, then we had a series of nannies, but none of them stayed, even when we paid them a fortune. Will escaped into his business, and when he did spend time with Olivia, he was cold. A pause. Strict. Cruel? Jen asked. He wouldn't have described it as that. The sun had risen above the house now and was shining across them, throwing long shadows across the lawn. Matthew waited for Elizabeth to continue. I discovered I was pregnant again. It wasn't planned. I considered an abortion, but in the end I couldn't do it. She paused. From the beginning, Imogen was a very different child. She ate and she slept at regular times. I suppose she was easy to love. A pause. Will found her easy to love. And Olivia resented her. Olivia hated her. She caused the bruises. Elizabeth nodded. I think she'll do anything for drama. Her life seems to be one long escape from boredom. If you found an empty bottle in the car, it will have been hers. She steals from us, gets older kids to buy booze for her. She's always disappearing in the evening, and we don't know where she is. And believe me, she can look a lot older than her age. Did you try to get help for her? The woman didn't answer directly. The girls started off in our local primary school, but Olivia was always in trouble. Will thought Brooks might provide the structure she needed. You didn't ask social services for help? CAMS? Elizabeth shook her head. Will would have seen that as failure, a matter of shame. To have a social worker prying into our lives? He's a great believer in self-reliance, except he's never at home to deal with it all. Her voice was faint with exhaustion. Matthew could imagine the relentless discussions about their daughter's future, battles continuing long into the night. Tell me what happened this morning. Did you get a phone call? Is that what Olivia told you? No. She asked me to drive here. And you just did as you were told. Jen couldn't help interrupting. I couldn't face another scene at school. Olivia refusing to go in. When we got to the shore, I needed air and space. I shouldn't have left them alone in the car together. I see that now. After all, I had Imogen's safety to think about. And Olivia, Matthew said. She needs help too. He paused. We're all redeemable. Do you really believe that? Her voice was mocking. I do. It was only as he spoke that he realized it was true. He looked through the window at the girls in the kitchen. They were still drawing. From here, they looked like perfectly well-adjusted children. You should talk to their father, Jen said. Or leave him. The three of you might cope better without him. Matthew was shocked. It wasn't their place to break up a family, but he said nothing and waited for Elizabeth to reply. Elizabeth stared out at the shore. Sometimes I dream of doing that, but I don't think I'm sufficiently brave. I didn't think I was that brave either. Jen paused. Matthew watched. Still he said nothing, and Jen continued speaking. My husband hit me. Olivia's troubled. Seems to me that not facing up to her problems is a kind of abuse too. There was a moment of silence. Elizabeth had started crying, but she made no noise. Matthew could hear the suck of the tide on the beach. The woman looked up at Jen. I wouldn't know where to start. I have friends who work in the field, Jen said. We can help, if you'd like us to. Matthew was aware that he was holding his breath. At last Elizabeth nodded slowly, as if an important decision had been made. I'll make some calls, Jen said. We'll go in, out of the cold. Elizabeth nodded again. A little later the family walked away, their mother in between the girls, her arms around them both. Olivia briefly rested her head on her mother's shoulder. Matthew stood on the terrace and watched them go. Back in the house, Jen was making tea. Good work, he said. She grinned. Hardly legitimate police stuff, though, is it? Not sure what the boss will say. Two detectives spending all morning on a sad little girl. It's crime prevention, Matthew said. Without you, who knows how it would end up. He thought of all the young women he'd met in his career, who had gone off the rails, committing ever more serious crimes. They had all once been sad little girls, with no one to look out for them. Perhaps this time, their intervention would make the difference. Keep listening for an exclusive opening extract from the 10th novel in Anne Cleeves's acclaimed Vera Stanhope series.
The Rising Tide, read by Janine Burkett. Chapter 1. Philip was first of the group to the island. He'd had to drive overnight, but it was worth the effort to get here before the morning high water, before the day trippers crossed from the mainland in their cars and coaches to buy ice cream and chips. He tried not to resent the squabbling children and the wealthy elderly, but he was always pleased when the island was quiet. As he did at every reunion, he wanted to sit in the chapel and reflect for some time in peace. This year would mark 50 years of friendship, and he needed to offer a prayer of thanks and to remember. The most vivid memory was of the weekend when they'd first come together on the island. Only Connect, the teacher had called it. Part outward-bound course, part encounter group, part team-building session. And there had been a connection, so strong and fierce, that after 50 years the tie was still there, unbroken and still worth celebrating. This was where it had all started. The next memory was of death and a life cut short. Philip had no fear of dying. Sometimes he thought he would welcome death, as an insomniac longs for sleep. It was as inevitable as the water, which twice a day slid across the sand and mud of the shore until the causeway was covered. Eventually, he would drown. His faith provided no extra comfort, only a vague curiosity. Almost he hoped that there would be no afterlife, Surely that would take energy, and there were days now when he felt that he had no energy left. It had seeped away in his service to his parish and the people who needed him. He did regret the deaths of others. His working life moved to the beat of funeral services, the tolling of the church bell, the march of pallbearers. He remembered the babies, who'd had no experience of life at all, the young, who'd had no opportunity to change and grow. He'd been allowed that chance, and he offered up another prayer of gratitude. An image of Isabel, so young, so bonny, so reckless in her desires and her thoughtlessness, intruded into his meditation, and he allowed his mind to wander. Was it Isabel who kept the group returning to the holy island of Lindisfarne every 5 years? Had her death at the first reunion bonded them together so tightly that despite their differences, they were as close as family? Perhaps that deserved gratitude too, because these people were the only family he had left. In the tiny chapel, with its smell of damp and wood polish, he closed his eyes and he pictured her, blonde and shapely, and sparking with life. A wide smile and energy enough for them all. From the first floor of the pilgrim's house, he'd seen her driving away to her death. He'd watched the argument that had led to her sudden departure. 45 years ago, Isabel had drowned literally. No metaphor had been needed for her. Her body had been pulled out of her car once the waters had retreated. Her vehicle had been swept from the causeway in the high tide of the equinox, tossed from the road like a toy by the wind and the waves. Once she'd set out on her way to the mainland, there had been no chance to save her. Had that been the moment when he'd changed from a selfish, self-opinionated, edgy young man to a person of faith? Perhaps the conversion had begun a little later, the evening of the same day, when he'd sat in this chapel in the candlelight with his friends, and they'd cried together, trying to make sense of Isabel's passing. Annie and Daniel, Lou and Ken, Rick and Philip. The morning had been complicated because none of them had liked Isabel very much. The men had all fancied her, oh yes, certainly that. She'd featured in Philip's erotic dreams throughout his undergraduate years. But she'd been too demanding and too entitled for them to like her. Philip opened his eyes for a moment. The low sunlight of autumn was flooding through the plain glass windows into the building. But he knew he had time for more reflection, more guilt, before the others arrived. He closed his eyes again to remember Isabel and that argument, which must surely have led to her death. He hadn't heard the words. He'd been in his first-floor room in the pilgrim's house, looking down, an observer, not a participant. Isabel and Rick had been fighting in the lane below him. There'd been no physical contact, it hadn't come to that. But Philip had sensed the tension, which was so different from the weekend's general mood of easy companionship. The fight had seemed important, almost intimate. Not a row between casual friends or strangers. Even if Philip had been closer, he might not have made out what was being said, because there was a storm blowing, and the wind would have carried the words away. He'd relished the drama of the scene, looking on with a voyeur's excitement, as he'd watched the row play out beneath him. Then, from where he'd stood, he'd seen Annie rounding the bend in the lane, a woven shopping bag in one hand. She must have been into the village for provisions. No longer a mother, she'd mothered them all that weekend. And now, all these years later, she was still the person who shopped and cooked. Rick and Isabel hadn't noticed her, because they were so focused on each other, spitting out insults. Rick had hurled one more comment, and suddenly Isabel had been flouncing away, her long hair blown over her face, feeling in the pockets of her flowery Laura Ashley dress for her car keys. At that point, Philip could have changed history. If he'd rushed downstairs and outside, he might have stood in front of the car and stopped her driving away. He'd known, after all, that the tide was rushing in, and it would be foolhardy to attempt the crossing. But Philip hadn't moved. He'd stayed where he was, staring out of the window like a nebby old woman, waiting to see what would happen next. And Isabel had started her car and driven to her death. So, here Philip was, a priest on the verge of retirement, an old believer yet with no great desire to meet his Maker. Here he sat, hands clasped and eyes shut, waiting for his friends, longing again for the connection and the ease that only they could give, pondering the moment of Isabel's death. It seemed to him now that he'd spent the rest of his life trying to find relationships that were as intense and fulfilling as those developed here. Nothing had lived up to expectation, not even, if he was honest, his trust in Christ. Perhaps that was why he'd never married. Later, there'd been women he'd fancied himself in love with, but there'd never been the same depth of understanding, and in the end he'd refused to compromise. If one of the women who'd shared that first weekend of connection had been free, perhaps that would have worked. Now it crossed his mind again that Judith, the teacher who'd brought them together, might make a suitable partner, that he might find company and intimacy in old age. They were both alone, after all. But Philip knew that he was probably too cowardly and too lazy to make a move. He smiled to himself. He wasn't sure he wanted to share his life after all this time. He was too comfortable, and too set in his ways. He got to his feet, walked down the narrow aisle and out into the sunshine. He could smell seaweed and salt. He felt at home. Chapter 2. Annie Laidler shut the deli door and locked it. A regular customer turned up 2 minutes late and looked through the window. Usually, Annie would have let her in, all smiles and welcome. But today she pretended not to see. Jax had already left, and this was October, a reunion year. Annie had been planning the moment for weeks. She began to pack the 2 wicker hampers with jars and dried goods. They'd already been pulled from the shelves and were standing in a line on the counter. Then she turned her attention to the fresh items. There were green and black olives, all scooped into separate tubs. Slices of charcuterie, glistening with fat. Cheese, Doddington, with its black rind and hard, sharp taste. Northumberland nettle, oozing brie and crumbling Wensleydale. Squat loaves of ciabatta and sourdough, baked by Jax early that morning. Local butter, wrapped in greaseproof paper. A taste of home for her friends who'd moved away, a reminder to them that she and the region had moved on. Still, at the last moment she added stotties, the flatbread cakes that they'd filled with chips when they'd all been kids, then home-baked ham and peas pudding. Traditional Geordie fare, a kind of irony, a joke that they'd all appreciate. Through this food, memories would be triggered, and anecdotes would follow. Images clicked into her head like slides dropping into an old-fashioned projector carousel. A school play dress rehearsal. Rick in full costume as Claudius, collapsing suddenly in giggles and the rest of them losing it. Except Philip, who was Hamlet, furious that his long speech had been interrupted. And Miss Marshall, their English teacher, almost in tears because she thought the performance itself would be a disaster. More slides. More images of only connect. the event originally organised by the school, or at least by Miss Marshall, as an attempt to bring together some of the new lower sixth. She wanted to challenge their preconceptions, she'd said, to open their minds to possibilities beyond Kimmerston Grammar. That initial weekend gathering, a kind of secular retreat, had turned them into this tight group. Still friends 50 years on, still meeting in the same place every 5 years. This time the recollection was of teenagers, talking endlessly, sitting at the long tables in the kitchen at the Pilgrim's house, dipping stotties into the veggie soup, hardly pausing the conversation long enough to eat. After the first reunion, and Isabel's death, Annie had wondered if the reunions would continue, but they had. Rick had said to meet up would be an act of remembrance. But after all this time, the mentions of Isabel had become a ritual, no more meaningful than the Friday night drinking or the Saturday afternoon walk. The hampers were almost too heavy for Annie to carry to the car. 5 years ago, she must have been fitter, stronger. She'd get someone to help her at the other end, one of the men. Rick was always keen to prove how macho he was, with his tales of marathons run and trips to the gym. Outside, the sun was low. They'd stuck with October for the reunions, and there was always this sense of the year coming to an end. That first meeting of Only Connect had been a time of transition. They all agreed on that, so the date seemed appropriate. Later, kids had come along. Annie had swallowed her envy and her hurt, and pretended to enjoy them. The reunion weekends had grown then. Sometimes the place had the vibe of a chaotic playgroup, and later of a youth club for moody teens. They'd only come together for evening chapel at dusk. Now the adults were alone again, and oddly it was as if they'd gone full circle. They had the same freedom and lack of responsibility as they'd had when they'd first come together as 16-year-olds. Tonight, she felt suddenly wild, ready for an adventure. Some of their children had become friends, and they met up too, independently in smart London wine bars. Not in an austere former convent on Holy Island, which had been refurbished now but still smelled a little of mould and elderly women, as if the ghosts of the original occupants still lingered. It was early evening when she arrived at the Pilgrim's house. She'd crossed the Lindisfarne Causeway over the sand and the mud from the mainland just before the evening tide, and the road was empty. There'd be no day trippers to the island now. The setting sun behind her threw long shadows from the rescue towers and set the shore on fire. Although she lived closest, Annie was always the last to arrive. She drove through the village and on towards the house, isolated in the centre of the island, surrounded by scrubby, wind-blown trees. From here, it felt like a real island. There was no view of the causeway, only of the castle, towering above them. The others' cars were parked in the lane. She sat in the van for a minute, with a sudden moment of shyness, even foreboding. The usual sense of awkwardness, as if she didn't quite belong. It had been different when she and Dan had still been married. He'd been at the original conference and she'd fallen in love with him then, deeply, dangerously, self-destructively as only a teenager can. It hadn't been his scene, and she'd sensed his discomfort throughout. But he'd come back with her to the first reunion. Then there'd been the tragedy of Isabel's death. She couldn't blame him for staying away after that. She couldn't blame him for anything. Not the guilt, nor the divorce, nor her loneliness. It was almost dark, and she could see a soft light of candles in the clear glass windows of the tiny chapel. There was no fancy stained glass here. She supposed the others were already inside and realized she must be even later than she'd anticipated. Perhaps they were waiting for her before they started their time of silence and meditation. She left the hampers in the van and hurried into the building. The candles had been lit on the table that served as an altar. There was that smell of old stone and incense. The roof was hardly bigger than one of the upturned cobles, the small boats pulled onto the beach during bad weather, and she thought she could smell the wood it was made from, too. Her friends were sitting on the wooden benches, taking the same seats as they always did. Habit now. They turned and smiled at her, but nobody spoke. That was the deal for evening chapel. 20 minutes of silence and private meditation. Prayer for those who believed in it. It had seemed alien to them as teenagers, but now, Annie thought, they welcomed the peace, the ritual. Annie took a seat near the back, and Phil stood up and gave the welcome, and started them off. Take this time to be grateful. But left to her own thoughts here in the chapel, Annie found gratitude hard to conjure. She sat with her eyes closed, and remembered a baby lying in a cot with blue covers, because Annie had decided she never wanted pink for her little girl, and saw the white, cold skin. When Philip brought them all back to the present, Annie found that her cheeks were wet with tears. She was pleased she was sitting at the back, and that the light was so poor, because she would have hated the others to see and to ask what the matter was. Chapter 3. Rick Kelsall sat in the chapel and let his mind wander. He'd never been very good at sitting still, and he struggled to stop his foot tapping on the stone floor. Also, it was bloody cold. His head was full of plans and ideas all jostling for priority. It had been an interesting day, and he still wasn't quite sure what he'd do with the information he'd gained. Then there was the book, which might redeem him, or at least bring him back into the public eye. He'd complained about the attention when he'd been on the telly every week, but now he missed his public. The smiles, the waves, the recognition. He'd only been gone for a few months, but it was as if he'd disappeared into a black hole. When people did know who he was, there was more likely to be abuse than admiration. He shifted in his seat and wished he'd worn a scarf. The door opened, and he turned to see Annie hurry into the building. She still looked good for her age. She'd never been a beauty like Charlotte, but she was interesting without trying, without realizing. He'd never fancied her, not really, not like he'd fancied Louisa. He'd always felt close to Annie, though. Friendship was too bland a word to describe it. He wriggled again, and tried to find a better way to express how he felt about her. Philip stood up to call them to order. When they'd first come here as teenagers, nobody would have bet on Philip becoming a priest, not in a million years. He'd been Rick's most exciting friend, full of anger and rebellion and wild, impossible plans. Now he seemed to live his life in a state of complacency and contentment. Philip had achieved, Rick supposed, a kind of wisdom. He no longer battled the inevitable. He knew he was getting old, but didn't seem to care. Soon he'd retire from his parish, and his life would become even more boring. He might well move north again, so predictable, and he'd live out his smug, boring life until he died. Perhaps Philip didn't even miss the adventures of their youth. Rick missed them all the time. He longed for them with a desperation that sometimes overwhelmed him. He would give anything to be 17 again, and sitting in this chapel for the first time. He would sell his soul for it. He wouldn't even mind being 22 and fighting with Isabel, then watching her drive away to her death. Then, at least, he'd felt alive. He realized that Philip had sat down once more. Rick hadn't heard anything he'd said, hadn't made the effort to listen. It would no doubt be much the same as at every reunion, every introduction. These days Philip provided comfort, not originality. The chapel was quieter than any other place Rick knew. He'd lived in the city since he'd left home for university, and there was always that background hum, traffic, the rumble of a train, people shouting in the street, even in the early hours. Rick disliked silence. He wondered why they had to go through this ritual every time they came back to the island, though part of him knew that he'd be the first to complain if one of the others suggested ditching it. Partly to be awkward, but also, he supposed, because this quiet time in the chapel was part of the whole experience. It reminded him again of his youth. For one weekend, he felt as if he was starting out again at the beginning, not approaching the end. Almost before he'd settled into it, the 20 minutes was over. Philip was on his feet again, and they were making their way out. Rick waited for a moment, letting the others go ahead of him, gearing up for the evening ahead. He felt like an actor preparing for another performance, and wondered briefly what it would be like for once in his life to go on stage unscripted and unrehearsed.
Thank you for listening to this audio production of The Girls on the Shore and The Rising Tide by Anne Cleeves, read by Jack Holden and Janine Burkett. Published by Macmillan, an imprint of Pan Macmillan, a division of Macmillan Publishers International Limited. Text copyright Anne Cleeves 2022. Recording copyright Macmillan Publishers International Limited 2022. The right of Anne Cleeves to be identified as the author of this work has been asserted by her in accordance with the Copyright Designs and Patents Act 1988. All rights reserved. Directed by Jonas Gustafsson. Production, recording and post-production by the Strathmore Studios, Clerkenwell, London. Sound editing by Alex Brown.